Hey, good afternoon, everyone. I think we have some folks still rolling in, but I see it's noon, so we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Carrie Riddle, and I'm the Assistant Director with the Criminal Investigations and Network Analysis, or CINA Center, DHS Center of Excellence here at George Mason University. Thank you very much for joining us online today for the next session in our spring speaker series, featuring talks on a variety of topics centered around transnational organized crime. Just a quick reminder to please keep your mics muted throughout the session today. And following today's talk, we'll have a Q&A session kindly moderated by Dr. Louise Shelley, a member of CINA's Science Leadership Committee and the director of the Terrorism, Transnational Crime, and Corruption Center here at Mason. I know we have folks viewing us through other spaces today via YouTube or MS Teams, so please feel free to type your questions in the chat at any point throughout the session today. To stay informed about upcoming talks in our spring speaker series, please sign up for our mailing list by visiting our website, cina.gmu.edu. Details for all CINA events and activities can also be found there, including a digital archive of past talks from our distinguished speakers. This afternoon, it's a pleasure to welcome and introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Jay Kennedy. Jay is an assistant professor at Michigan State University, jointly appointed to the School of Criminal Justice and the Center for Anti-Counterfeiting and Product Protection, where he serves as the assistant director of research. He is a faculty affiliate with the Michigan State University Graduate School and an affiliated faculty member with the Institute for Public Policy and Social Research, the Center for Business and Social Analytics, and the Canadian Studies Center. Dr. Kennedy's current research explores several domains, including the sale of counterfeit goods on the internet through social media and e-commerce. His work has been published in a large variety of academic and research outlets, and he is currently serving as an elected board member of the American Society of Criminology's Division of White Collar and Corporate Crime. The title of his talk today is The Future of Counterfeiting. And Dr. Kennedy, we're very pleased to have you here today. And if you're ready, I'll hand the floor over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Carrie. I really appreciate it. And big thank you to CINA and GMU for inviting me out today to talk about this issue. I've got a lot of great stuff to talk about. I'd love to hear some questions, have some good engagement afterwards if anyone has them. But in essence, as Carrie mentioned, we're going to be talking about, or I'll be talking about today, what I see are some of the main issues that lie on the horizon with regard to product counterfeiting. I'm going to anchor my talk in the beginning with regard to COVID-19, and obviously its global impact can't be ignored, but its impact on counterfeiting has been both good and bad. The positives we've yet to fully identify, but I think that the elements are there to pull out some really, really good strategic concepts that can address some of the issues and mitigate some of the risks that consumers face in this space. Okay, so again, as you can see, title of my presentation, as you look at the subtitle here, ultimately, what I believe we need to drive to is to look at the ways in which enforcement, anti-counterfeiting activities, brand protection activities need to and are shifting in light of the changing opportunity structures that are going on right now in the environment, and in particular, how that those changing opportunity structures are being driven by a number of factors, but one of the more nefarious ones, or the more difficult ones to handle, is consumer engagement, or the role of consumers in the sale and distribution of counterfeit goods. That's a really, really wicked challenge that we're going to dig into a bit here, and one that I think we need to spend a lot of time noodling about. So to begin, obviously, again, COVID-19 significantly changed everything in the world. We're rolling up on 2 years of it being recognized, at least in the U.S., as a significant health threat. Back in January, we passed the anniversary of the WHO identifying it as a significant health threat. But almost about 20 months of it having a significant impact on the sale and distribution of counterfeit goods. It was in March, mid to late March of 2020, that U.S. Customs and Border Protection started seizing fake COVID-19 test kits. And so we saw the beginnings of counterfeit and fake products around the COVID-19 pandemic entering into American society. And so again, created some substantial shifts. So before COVID, the counterfeiting landscape looked obviously a little bit different. one of the things that we use to kind of benchmark or understand where counterfeit products are going is official data on the goods that are seized coming into this country. And so it's an imperfect measure, but it's one of the more stable and reliable ones that we have. And it's something that's tracked year over year. So prior to COVID, if we look at US Customs and Border Protection reports, they showed stable trends in the types of goods, the products that were seized, as well as the locations from which those products came. So we saw a lot of footwear, we saw a lot of apparel, handbags, purses, watches, things like that. Low on the list were things like food, electronics, and pharmaceuticals. Uh, and typically, these things have been generating, coming from source economies like China, Hong Kong, Taiwan. Those have been the primary three over the years. And so really stable in that across time. Um, these reports also highlight the impact of commerce and a shifting trend away from certain modes of transportation of infringing goods that are coming into the US. Now, importantly, right before the pandemic, or a couple years before the pandemic, we saw a significant rise in the number of mail shipments, right? So prior to 2017, most of the focus was on container ships, things coming in through express mail, through airports. And 2017 was a watershed year where we really saw this huge uptick in direct to consumer mailing. Now, in that 2016, no, I'm sorry, 2017, 2018, 2019 year, there was recognition of this issue. The federal government even recognized the important role that international mail facilities play in addressing, in particular, counterfeit pharmaceuticals coming in, but there wasn't a really cohesive strategic plan around it. So, number one, trend identified prior to COVID that this was happening, but we saw it more as a change in the ways in which counterfeiters chose to bring their goods into the country as a way to avoid the large-scale resources that existed at our ports of entry. Right? The pre-COVID estimate suggests that e-commerce transactions by this year, the end of this year, would reach about $859 billion. It's a big number, right? We have been tracking for probably the last 15, 17 years, this steady upward tick in the role of e-commerce in retail sales. It has been taking on larger and larger proportions of the commerce or the retail environment. But prior to COVID, that growth was expected to be pretty linear. There were no unexpected bumps that were expected to happen because we figured that technology would be moving at sort of a linear pace as well. The customer adoption would still be based in large part around consumers' desire to go online, their comfort and in the products that they would buy or the types of sites that they would go to, and then the ability of retailers to put certain goods online, but also the restriction of certain goods from being sold online. So, for instance, regulated products like pharmaceuticals and things like that. There were no sort of large scale trends that at least were foreseen from the analyst perspectives prior to COVID that would have caused a significant shift up. Now, this is obviously important. Now we can look back on it with kind of rose colored glasses and see why that was, why it turned out to be wrong. But the value, the importance of e-commerce as a medium for connecting counterfeiters with consumers was not really realized until after COVID. And I'll get into that a little bit, but it's important to remember that prior to that, we always saw e-commerce as an area, but we figured that the trends would follow in line with its sort of steady growth up. But beyond e-commerce, right, there were many industry insiders who were watching the potential disruptions that would come from this thing called social commerce. Now, social commerce is just commerce and trade that happens on a social network, right? So it started out, the big thing was with WhatsApp, and with WeChat. And then obviously it's migrated over since then to platforms like TikTok and Instagram, YouTube, Facebook, what have you. Any type of network that was designed to be a way to connect people from across the globe in social interactions that was then used to facilitate transactions and commerce between those individuals without a specific third-party intermediary like a brand or distributor selling directly to them, where the sales were based more on a relational perspective, is social commerce. And even though they knew that would come, some people argued that, as you can see here, quote, people don't associate social media with shopping. Right? So let's think about that statement. 2018 is when this came out in Forbes. What do we think about it now? And we'll get into that, right? But stark contrast. So this is the world that we were living in. And then as a final point, pre-COVID, counterfeiting had what I'd like to call a decidedly regional and consumption feel to it. And what I mean by that is most of the effort, most of the activity, at least from a brand protection standpoint, from, if you walked up to a normal consumer on the street and asked them, what is counterfeiting? Have you ever bought a counterfeit? It would relate to a purse or, a pair of shoes or some other type of luxury type consumer good that was, again, part of a consumption mindset. When I say it had a decidedly regional feel, that obviously didn't work all the way across the globe. If we look in developing world nations like sub-Saharan Africa, counterfeiting of pharmaceuticals was a huge problem. And it was because of issues in the supply chain, right? We also had some regional differences in the manufacturing of counterfeit goods. So prior to COVID, one of the big distinctions that we saw was, China, Taiwan were big source economies, Vietnam, of manufactured products where, say a luxury purse we manufactured with the counterfeit logo on it and then sent out across the world through various distribution networks. In Eastern Europe, what we saw was the development of kind of a co-manufacturing. They would buy the base product from a manufacturer in China or whatever. It would not have the logo on it. They would make the logo in the home country in some place in Eastern Europe, and then they would attach that logo to the product. And so the product didn't actually become a counterfeit until it was in that second stage manufacturing facility. We saw this pattern a bit in the US as well. We saw it in South America. But again, a bit of a regional flavor to it, which would impact the way in which law enforcement and brand owners went about doing their job and trying to enforce against these infringements. So sorry, I already said that. And then again, consumers were typically making decisions that were based upon a desire for consumption rather than a need for protection. And this is generally, right? We didn't see this, obviously, when people purchasing counterfeit medicines in developing world nations, that doesn't work. But in most cases, if we think about like a US-based example, it was more for consumption, right? Pre-COVID, that's the issue, right? And mainly because people could say, well, I don't need to buy medicine from a guy who's got a blanket out in the middle of the street. I can just go to the pharmacist and get it. Or I don't need to buy this other, needed essential item because I can go to the store and get it. And I'm not going to risk buying a fake, which, if you buy a fake purse, yeah, it's a fake purse. Right? So that was life pre-COVID. So what happens after COVID? Obviously, switch gets flipped, everything changes. There were a couple things that happened in the environment that just naturally drove us toward an increasing exposure to risk from counterfeit products. So one obviously is the closure of physical retailers and the growth of e-commerce. The other one is the need for certain types of products. So in some of the reports that we've seen prior to COVID, the EU's Intellectual Property Office has shown that, hey, seizure numbers have actually fallen. There have been fewer counterfeits moving through the countries that were seized. The question that we need to ask ourselves is, what will the 2021 report hold? And I think if we kind of map this out on a scale, we'll see that 2020 is a bit of an anomaly where people were, I think a lot of consumption was reduced generally, or that the products that people were buying were moving through different channels that were not normally watched by customs enforcement. And so you had counterfeits moving through that. That's fear. But I think 2021 will show a different response, where 2020 was kind of a low dip on the radar screen, but 2021 is going to go up. And we've seen some of the anecdotal reports about that. In terms of the US, 2020 showed a continued decline from 2019 in the number of seizures and the value of the seizures. So the yellow line on this chart is the value, or the MSRP. The blue line is the number of seizures. Now, quick caveat, US CBP and EU, when they talk about the value of a product, they place upon it what the MSRP for the legitimate product would be, not the actual sale price or the margin that the counterfeiters may make, because that's difficult to determine. And so that number always is going to be a bit inflated, right? Or feel a bit inflated, but it still gives you a sense of the types of products that are moving through. So more of a decline in the MSRP, which would suggest that even though seizures went up, we're seeing sort of lower value or lower dollar items that are being seized at the ports of entry. And so one would think that given these numbers through 2020, and we're still waiting on the 2021 CBP report to come out, that counterfeiting has gone down, that COVID has had a positive impact on mitigating some of the risk that consumers are exposed to because fewer products are moving through the environment. That may not necessarily be the case and is definitely not the end of this story. One of the reasons for that is because, like in the US and all over the globe, COVID has led to a significant number of people shopping online. There was some research that was done in 2020 by the Alliance for Safe Online Pharmacies that looked at the extent to which Americans were willing to go online to buy regulated products like pharmaceuticals. And they found that a majority of people who previously had bought their pharmaceuticals in a physical retail location went online to do so because their physical options were either closed, they were concerned about going out into the public and being exposed to the virus, or they found better pricing online. Most worrying about this is that a majority of those people who were the first time to go online and buy said they would likely continue to buy online once the pandemic had passed. Now, what's worrying about that from a pharmaceutical perspective is that the vast majority, over 90%, according to ASOP, of online pharmacies are illicit. So they sell either fake, substandard, counterfeit drugs, what have you. The other important caveat to this is that we saw a lot of Americans who were previously reluctant to take on technology, to engage in online commerce, doing so and moving into the space, realizing what the benefits are, but not having the knowledge of the self-protective mechanisms to avoid the risks that come with online shopping. And so we saw this big growth of e-commerce. We saw a ton of people getting involved in it, a ton of people going online to buy, but the threats also proliferated because you've obviously got a burgeoning area of consumers in there who are unable to protect themselves from the scams and the frauds that are going on by not only counterfeiters but other fraudsters, which at that time are also proliferating because that's where the consumers are. One of the biggest growth areas that we've seen in the pandemic has been over-the-counter medications, so non-prescription medications. Now, this added another layer of issue and concern because you don't need a prescription to get it. And so it's not like you go to a website and they say, hey, how'd you like to buy some Vicodin or opioids or Viagra? And you don't need a prescription, don't worry about it. This is, hey, how'd you like some cold medicine or Tylenol or something else that you normally don't need a prescription for anyway. But instead of, there's no real way to vet whether or not those things were legitimate, particularly for consumers who didn't have the knowledge. One of the things that we've seen that sort of supports the increased risk is that during the pandemic, e-commerce adoption rates grew between 32 and 43.7%. Prior to the pandemic, the high was 16.8% on a yearly basis. Now, must be said that the most recent studies have shown that there's been a dramatic drop-off in the past 2 quarters. So the last 2 quarters of 2021, substantial drop-off in the amount of e-commerce adoption, but the damage had already been done, right? The growth rate is not declining, it's still going up. It's just not going up as fast as it was during the major parts of the pandemic. And so when you talk about a growth rate of 43.7%, that is substantial in the number of first-time people who are going online to buy. And what we haven't seen is a similar increase in the number of website takedowns, of seizures of products, of interdictions that have been happening in the space. So the risks we know are increasing. Last point about the impact of COVID has been just around the products themselves. So even if people did not go online to buy more, the fact that COVID has shifted so many people into being at risk for buying products that are related to their health and safety is substantial in and of itself. One of my earlier points, right, I mentioned that for most, at least for American consumers, it's a consumption business. They're looking for purses and wallets and things like that. They would never think about, going online to buy certain things that were related to health and safety. But how many people went online to buy in what they thought to be N95 or later KN95 or M95 masks during the pandemic? How many people are still doing that? How many people went online to buy hydrochloroquine or a COVID-19 test or any other treatment that was put out there, let alone the fake stuff and the frauds that were there? But early on in the pandemic, there were schemes uncovered where legitimate healthcare providers had purchased counterfeit COVID-19 and were selling it to people for between a couple hundred to $1,000 a shot. This is something new that many consumers never had to deal with. The trust, particularly in the United States, of the legitimate healthcare system and the ability to get products that are real, that can protect you from health and safety risks, is so high that many people never question whether or not there was something illicit going on. And counterfeiters rolled in right away. Added to that were the supply chain disruptions that happened that they were able to take advantage of and backfill the demand that couldn't be met by the legitimate products. Importantly, what we saw was that a quarter of the shipments seized in 2020 came through an international mail facility. Now, there are 9 international mail facilities in the US. A quarter of all the products that they seized came through one of these facilities, meaning that the counterfeiters are now not shipping in, or some of them are not shipping in containers or large air cargo shipments. They're filling customer requests the same way that Amazon and eBay and Alibaba and everybody else is filling them in the online environment. They're shipping it directly to you. Much more difficult to interdict. When you do make shipments, the value of those shipments is much smaller, but also it requires a resource there to be able to identify and pull those products out of line. That does not exist in the level to where we would like it to be in these 9 IMFs. And so simply on a sheer volume perspective, we know that more things are moving through and getting to consumers. So for many Americans, counterfeiting has become not just an issue of consumerism, but it's a continued threat to health and safety. So even before COVID-19, where the main thrust for anti-counterfeiting activities was, we know that there are these counterfeit websites out there selling pharmaceuticals where people could be injured. We know there are counterfeits getting into the legitimate healthcare supply chain, and potentially being implanted in the people. But the biggest threats come from the impact of brand owners from other forms of counterfeit products. We can't say that's the case anymore. And so that reality needs to cause a shift in the way in which we approach anti-counterfeiting activities going forward, and the way in which we talk to consumers to try and understand why their buying behavior shift and why they continue to engage in activities that expose them to risk and engage in risky behavior. And of course, not everyone acknowledges that threat because they keep buying. So, all right, what's going to define the post-COVID counterfeiting landscape? And I've got a couple points here I'd like to talk about that I think will really sort of set the stage for not only what we should do in terms of research, but also from a practical perspective to understand what the landscape will look like and how we can address and mitigate some of these risks that are emerging. And these 3 areas are the changes that are happening in the online environment, those changes that are continuing to happen, the continual disruptions to the global supply chain, we all know about those. And then importantly, and this is like the wicked problem of wicked problems, the shifting role of consumers and their perceptions of counterfeit goods, and specifically their perceptions of counterfeit goods. And I'll talk about their role in counterfeiting schemes as we go forward. So changes in the online e-commerce environment. If you've not bought anything online yet, if anyone on this session has not bought anything online yet, what's wrong, right? You should have bought something online at this point by now. And you probably will at some point. Now, the way in which you buy obviously has changed over time, from the way that eBay did things to the way that Amazon does things to now being able to buy things through social media and social commerce. Social media and social commerce are 2 things that are substantially changing the ways in which consumers engage with counterfeits online. And I'll talk more about that a little bit later from the consumer perspective, but from the perspective of the social media companies, This has now become a substantial area for growth for them from the standpoint of revenue. Developing relationships with online platforms such as the TikTok Shopify relationship that is substantially changing not only the sale of counterfeit goods, but the sale of legitimate goods and the role of influencers. Things like drop shipping and affiliate marketing schemes are creating a dynamic where the counterfeiters don't have to operate as a third party seller on an e-commerce platform in order to reach a large number of consumers. All they need to do is form relationships with individuals who have very vast networks and the ability and willingness to influence those networks to engage in certain buying behaviors. That's all counterfeiters need to sell their products. They can step back and place another veil, at least one veil, if not two or three, between them and law enforcement or the platforms that are looking to interdict against these activities and shield themselves from a lot of oversight and a lot of the activities that would otherwise have taken their products out of the marketplace. Yes, they lose a little bit of margin because they have to pay commissions to the social media influencers. They have to pay a bit more in terms of shipping costs. But the way that the global shipping market has been going and had been going prior to COVID, with the impact to container shipping rates due to decreases in volume, the fact that air freight was significantly down, and so companies were looking for more cargo to fill that, gave shippers and distributors very favorable shipping rates that are likely to continue going forward. Right? And I'll talk about free trade zones in a minute, but this large drive toward increasing global shipping capacity or global transportation capacity has created at least a temporary environment where financially it makes sense to send things, smaller packages, many more at a higher rate, because that cost is still not cost prohibitive. Right? But main trend that's coming on social media, social commerce, as those two things develop and shift, and whoever knows what's coming next, right? Those things are going to continue to impact what counterfeiting looks like. I mentioned TikTok and Shopify a minute ago, and this is something that definitely deserves a lot of attention, and not just TikTok and Shopify specifically, but also this model of going to market. And the idea that you can have a platform whereby individuals engage with each other in a way that is rewarded by the amount of people who like or follow or engage with that influencer, and using that as capital to get someone to buy into a product. And the big shift there, and the big thing that's really challenging for brands in that space, is that it's not now just about the value of your brand that you as a company can develop. It's not how well you market a product and develop something for consumers and get out there so that they can see what you have to offer and engage with that product and really identify with it. Now it's about how well can someone else sell your product? How well can they be an ambassador to their network for the goods that you have? And if they can do that really, really well, you're going to see a lot of sales. Even if it's short-term sales, you're going to see them. And the value of those relationships then gets enhanced. Now, you can do your own product drops, right? You're still going to have your own marketing, but particularly if you want to reach a niche community, this is the way to do it. For counterfeiters, this creates a great opportunity because they can set up programs through influencers, through affiliate marketers, whereby those individuals go on these websites, they put together a list of products, and then they advertise them to people. As we've been doing some work here at the center, one of the projects that I had a student work on was to look into the affiliate marketing program on the website dhgate.com. And so he signed up to be an affiliate marketer, and DHgate suggested to him a handful of products that he should sell and promote to his network. And one of those products was a very nondescript black jacket. And as the student did some more digging, he saw that in the product reviews, that very nondescript black jacket was actually a Nike counterfeit. Had the Nike logo and the symbols and all that stuff and all the tags. And so unwittingly, if this person, if my student had been a normal consumer and said, oh, that's a great jacket, I'm going to sell that and push that through my network, he would have been involved in the counterfeiting scheme. The individuals who got this product would have been probably pleased to find out that the jacket that they bought was a Nike, because people would have identified with the quality of that brand. And it would have been facilitated through a relationship like the TikTok Shopify pattern. And so that creates a series of unwitting accomplices, but also a lot of veils that are difficult to pierce when we want to understand who's behind ultimately these counterfeiting schemes. And then the final trend that we need to talk about is one that, of course, should be on everyone's radar screen, but the metaverse. We've seen what's happening with NFTs and going crazy, and who knows where this is going to go. The unfortunate thing and the unfortunate lesson that the metaverse is teaching us right now, which we should have learned before, but it seems that we've never learned this lesson, is that as these new technologies come on board, right, intellectual property rights are one of the last things that most people consider. Right. The first thing is, how is this going to be adopted, right? How do we, in some cases, how do we monetize this? How do we get this out to more people so that they can get greater access to this wonderful technology and this new solution? Counterfeiters and other nefarious actors are sitting back there thinking, how can I use this to make money? How can I change my scheme to pull more people into it? How can I create an NFT that, it's got, a Nike logo in it, or I'm taking some copyrighted piece of art and changing that in such a way that it creates this really cool token that somebody's going to want. And some people think, oh, this is just cool. This is art. This is me being unique. But many others are thinking, this is a great way for me to make money and to separate myself from the normal patterns of the normal avenues that would be easily detectable by brand owners, law enforcement, what have you. The discussion about the dark paths down which these technologies can go does not have to be one that stymies growth and innovation, but it has to be one that actually and legitimately acknowledges the risks that exist and at least tries to mitigate those risks through either discussions or some type of proactive solutions that cut off opportunities that we can foresee before they occur. Now, of course, we can't identify everything, right? Some emergent trends we will never see coming, but others we can definitely see happening. TikTok, Shopify, we should know right away that counterfeiters are going to take advantage of that. What can we do on the front end to mitigate some of those risks? And obviously, social media companies are doing things that we don't know about. But it seems like as these things get set up, the rush to get them out there, to be first to market and to pioneer these activities, even before they finish the beta phase, right? To build that greenfield out, happens without a full consideration of how they'll be usurped by counterfeiters and other illicit actors. Now, this shift, one of the shifts we're also seeing is to more personalized online shopping experiences, right? This is something we see with TikTok and Shopify. I've had students show me videos of people on TikTok and Instagram. They'll say, "Hey, here's a Nike, sweatshirt," and they'll custom like print with a homemade sewing machine, the Nike logo and whatever you want on it. Any trademarks, sports teams, whatever. There are endless customization options that are available to consumers. Now, what that means is that trend that we saw and that we have been seeing of more products moving through mail facilities and through the direct mail system is going to increase, right? If you create a customized product, you can't, ship that through, or I guess you can, but it's not efficient to ship it through in a large container to, New York and then wait for it to move through the transit system to get to the consumer. It's much better and it's much more effective as a company, if we think about counterfeiters as companies or as brands, to be more customer service oriented and ensure that your customers are getting their products on time through very efficient means. And so I could expect that we're going to see an exacerbated flow of counterfeit goods as we see things like social commerce coming on board more often. The TikTok, Shopify, and that model becoming more prevalent. And as the metaverse kicks off, there will be more personalization, more of these things moving through. Purchasing a counterfeit is going to become, whether knowingly or unknowingly, right? It's going to become more centralized in these virtual spaces, whereas distribution is going to be decentralized through physical spaces. These two things, even though they could be considered juxtaposing, combine to create a myriad challenges for interdiction. If purchasing becomes more centralized in virtual spaces, it means that having a product stored in a centralized area like Santee Alley or Chinatown, or somebody who owns a corner store that's selling counterfeits, is not a necessity. You don't have to have a large volume of products coming in that needs to have fake paperwork and hopefully get through customs and then get distributed through some physical space. You can have people go online to virtual spaces, and whether by customized or not customized, pick and choose the products they want. Distribution still has to happen in a physical space, but once you get outside of that centralized location, you get outside of the ability to spot large scale counterfeits. Now, the guy with the pop up tent on the corner selling fake Gucci and Louis Vuitton may still be there, but those roles may be substantially less than what we've seen in prior years because people can get them shipped directly to their home. Because COVID-19 has driven so much of us online, and because we've become so comfortable with shopping online, and because thanks to Amazon Prime, we've become very, I guess we've come to expect rapid shipping, right? I should get things in 2 days, if not the next day, if it's in stock. If counterfeiters are able to follow that model and fill that type of customer demand or need, then the need to have large amount of products in a physical space goes away. What does this mean for a local law enforcement agent who identifies a few counterfeit products and is trying to get a county prosecutor to take on the case? It's no longer, hey, I identified, the storefront that's selling things, and there's $500,000 to $1 million of counterfeit merchandise in the back. It's now, hey, I found this guy that's got like 3 purses. Those cases aren't likely going to filter through, and so it's going to move down on the radar screen in terms of importance for those prosecutors. Local law enforcement are going to focus on it, and unless we bolster the activities and the interdiction of capabilities at IMFs, more of these things are going to slip through. So again, we're creating this space whereby a lot of opportunities are opening up for counterfeiters and other nefarious actors. But it's not just e-commerce and social commerce that are going to be driving these changes to the nature by which the global counterfeit goods supply chain moves. COVID-19 has made sure that. The pandemic has wrought, as we all know, havoc on the global supply chain, and its impacts are going to continue to be felt for a long time. If you want proof of this, just look at the global chip shortage. Right? The shift in manufacturing due to the shift in consumer demand away from if you're a chip manufacturer, sort of general automotive, personal computing, electronics, towards more of the personal electronics as people worked from home and away from automotive because people weren't buying, right? We've seen what's been happening with automotive prices. We know that that won't correct itself for at least another, 12 to 18 months, people are saying, right? We know that there are impacts long-term in the supply chain of electronic goods. What does this mean for counterfeit products? We live in a world where we expect to have things available to us. Difficult to go out there and find a counterfeit Ford or GM or Chrysler. Very easy to go out there and find a counterfeit iPhone or laptop or some other electronic device that uses microchips or microprocessors as well. So those disruptions in the supply chain have meant that counterfeiters have an opportunity to fill again that gap that exists because legitimate manufacturers can't get their legitimate products to market. With us consumers being either unable to determine the legitimate from the fake or unwilling to consider the sources of the products that we're buying if they are not from the formal channel in the legitimate supply chain. So again, the automotive example, right? We know that this is going to have an impact. It's going to be beyond just manufacturing. It's also in spare parts or replacement parts. Prior to the pandemic, spare automotive components were a huge issue, right? We all know the airbag issue, even with name badges and counterfeit grills for cars, replacement parts, big problem. We have, well, unless you're in Michigan where I am, you're looking forward to the end of the winter season. We're supposed to be getting more snow here today. But auto accidents, right? As we keep seeing these issues going on, replacement parts, spare parts are also coming at a premium. What's that going to do for opportunity, right? Obviously going to increase it. And so those changes, those shifts in the global supply chain won't go away once the pandemic is over. The ripple effects are likely going to continue for a long period of time. Right? The other important development that's worth talking about is the rise of free trade zones. Now, this was seen as a source of concern, obviously, prior to the pandemic, but it's only been exacerbated thereafter. This is a chart that shows the growth of free trade zones. And so if you think about this, and if we extend this out to 2020, where we are today, we'd have a good sort of picture of free trade zones from their real beginning in Ireland in like the late 1960s, even though they've been on the books for a long time, up until today. And the break point that we can see is right about the 1995, 97, whatever that tick mark is. So if we, let's just say that where that yellow line there in the middle is, let's say it's about what, 1997, there were about 1,000, maybe a little over 1,000 free trade zones in the world. Today, we are well over 5,700 free trade zones. Now, why are free trade zones important? Well, obviously, the big concern is that there's reduced customs presence in free trade zones. The purpose of a free trade zone is to assist with and to support manufacturing, remanufacturing, and the packaging and distribution of products in an environment that is either tariff-free or reduced to tariff. Jebel Ali, if you haven't heard about Jebel Ali, is a huge counterfeiting transshipment point. It's a huge transshipment point in Dubai in the UAE, right? The African Continental Free Trade Zone is specifically set up to increase intracontinental and global trade amongst African economies, which has been supported in large part by China's investment in infrastructure with regard to building ports, building shipping infrastructure, building air infrastructure, as well as a growth in manufacturing capacity and knowledge, all designed to increase global trade. When you have that in an environment where you have a reduced customs footprint, you have the ability to manufacture and remanufacture on site, we know this is going to be a growing concern. And so within these areas, we have a place not only to hide or mask the source origin of a product, something that's manufactured in China comes into a free trade zone, gets repackaged, does not have to show that it was manufactured in China, aside from the label that they have to put on it, but they can change that. And so it looks like it's coming from a different route. People will perceive potentially that it's not as bad as something coming from the normal route. And so it may fly under the radar screen, at least for a little while. Or something that is not a counterfeit, as I mentioned with the Eastern European example before, will come into a free trade zone and can turn into a counterfeit while it's in a country where it's going to be distributed, right? So free trade zones exist all over the world. If that remanufacturing happens in a country in a lowered customs environment, the opportunities to move counterfeits into that country is much easier. It's much less challenging than if you're moving them through the normal channels. Last thing I want to talk about is consumer-driven changes. So again, consumers have come to expect many more options to purchase and receive goods. Expedited shipping is something that we just expect now, rather than it's not a pricey exception anymore. These changes to consumerism, they bring about some positive benefits, but they have substantially opened doors for counterfeiters, right? So there's more choice, there's lower cost for items, faster shipping, more personalized experience. That's great. One of the other major things that we've been seeing happening, though, is that individuals online have become content generators and product sellers. So as I mentioned earlier, you have an influencer who is essentially doing the work of a marketer and for the marketing company, and they are generating the demand for these counterfeit goods. We can see this online all the time, right? So just some quick examples I was able to pull off. You can go onto YouTube and look up any of these things and find a number of people, hundreds of them, that are talking about designer dupes or reps or counterfeit bags. And here's the ones I bought on Amazon, and here's the ones I bought on Walmart.com, and here's the ones I bought on AliExpress. And here's how you buy them. Here's how you tell the good ones from the bad ones. And so we have an entire industry cropping up of individuals who are doing nothing but being experts on how to identify, buy, secure counterfeit products. And also telling people, you know, this ain't that bad, right? They're really good quality, and they are normalizing this type of behavior. The other thing that's really difficult that we're seeing is that social media influencers are literally shifting the product counterfeiting lexicon. And this is something we identified in a study that we did last year. And so one of the things that we pulled out was this term dupe, right? So you'll see dupe purses all the time. The challenge with something like dupe, if you just hear it, and in a normal context, we would say, counterfeit, right? That's something we can act against if we're sort of scraping for certain keywords or terms. If you hear the word dupe, which is short for duplicate, it can mean one of two things. It could mean that There's a lesser known but legitimate name brand item that has the same features or can be used in the same way as a more expensive product. We see a lot of makeup dupes, right? So someone will say, hey, instead of buying a MAC cosmetic, go to CVS, buy this, you mix them together and it gives you the same effect or the same quality as a MAC cosmetic. But they're still, pushing a legitimate product. The other way is a counterfeit version of the legitimate name brand product, right? So, hey, here's a dupe of Kylie Jenner's lipstick. And they look the same, they feel the same. The quality of the packaging is about the same. This one's a little bit different, but this is a dupe. So it's the context. If you're listening to a conversation, it's the context that determines whether or not someone is talking about a counterfeit or legitimate item. The issue that this has caused is that people are now, at least as what we've seen with our research, that some consumers have a lower aversion to counterfeit products because they see them on the same level as legitimate products. The risks are removed or lessened because of the ways in which they are talked about. We see the same thing with replica or reps, right? Generally, this term is used by fans of a brand who want to discuss a replica product, right? Something that replicates legitimate. But what we've also seen is that it calls out a clear distinction in quality relative to a counterfeit. Now, why this is important is that people who buy replicas aren't saying that counterfeits are bad. They're just saying, I don't want a cheap quality counterfeit. I want a really good high quality counterfeit. And there's a value in having a good quality replica, not a counterfeit item. So overall, we're seeing from the consumer side a lot of shifts in the aversion to buy counterfeits because people have come to accept them as legitimate. Now, when we look at addressing future risks for counterfeiting, a couple of things need to happen. One, changes in the global supply chain and the growth of e-commerce, right? They're going to have an impact on the effectiveness of anti-counterfeiting activities. Getting out ahead of these issues is important, but also watching for trends and looking for very innovative or entrepreneurial ways to address those trends as they develop is key. Patterns of enforcement, the proactive and the responsive solutions, they have to adapt to the new realities of product counterfeit. It is not going to be the same thing. And investment in new strategies, new technologies need to be something that is adaptable and shiftable over time. The primary way that these effective strategies are going to work is through public-private partnerships. So this is my opinion, and there's a number of reasons why I believe that's the case. Right? And so public-private partnerships, right? We've all recognized, right, that having access to data is increasingly important to the success of any business, even counterfeiting. Brand protection is no different. It is about having access to data. The problem is the data are siloed, right? There are data that's held by the brand owners, there's data that's held by law enforcement, there's data that's held by the e-commerce platforms. And there currently is not an environment wherein there's an efficient sharing of those data resources that allows action to occur. So I look at data sharing, effective data sharing, as the grand challenge that we need to address. And this involves all players, brand owners, e-commerce and social media, payment processors, law enforcement, and even consumers. Now, in this, consumers are the difficult one to address, right? But there are some key questions that we need to answer. And creating the environment in which these questions can be answered is the way I think that we address this grand challenge. Obviously figuring out what can be shared and with whom do we share these data. Figuring out, does this expose us, if you're a brand owner or other individuals, to liability? And then finally answering that question of why should I share data? I think if we answer those questions, we'll get to a good, unique solution to this challenge of effective data sharing, which can help everyone to be a bit more proactive and more effective in their responsive efforts as well. Now, we have seen that there are some public-private partnerships developing. Those have focused on reducing the risk of sharing, particularly when you can leverage action from another partner. But beyond that, we've seen that they allow for some really long-term substantive relationships to develop between organizations. And there's a good brainstorming to come out of them. They also lay the foundation for the development of effective oversight and regulation. Now, we should really keep our eyes on the America Competes Act because it has now incorporated both the Shop Safe and the Informed Consumers Act into it to see what happens from the standpoint of regulation of the e-commerce space and the push toward more data being shared in a way to create transparency in the online environment. The collection of data, the sharing of the data is vitally important there. We do have some initial examples of partnership and success, and hopefully this presentation will be made available to you afterwards. You can go through and look at them. The IPR Center has started an e-commerce data sharing initiative, which is a great collaboration between several e-commerce partners, although we haven't seen anything come out of it yet. Hopefully it will. And then we've seen Facebook and Amazon partnering up with both law enforcement and brands to go after counterfeiters and social media influencers who have been acting on their sites. And so the beginnings of these public-private partnerships that can lead to really good investments, obviously built upon data sharing, but also on collaborative engagement in this space. So just some concluding thoughts. There's only one certainty when it comes to the future of product counterfeiting, and that is things will change. Commerce is going to change, the way in which consumers engage in the space, that's going to change. Counterfeiting is going to change as well. As technology and social innovation occurs, we need to look for proactive opportunities, right? We need to look entrepreneurially in ways where we can address these counterfeiting risks and identify those opportunities that counterfeiters will exploit and close those off as much as we can, or at least station guardians there to identify when that exploitation starts to occur. And then finally, again, data sharing and collaborative enforcement strategies. These are key. They are essential to having an effective engagement with regard to the global counterfeiting landscape. Now, this means not only just in the US, but also with our international partners to ensure that we are capturing the development of these structures as they occur in real time around the globe. And so I want to say thank you very much for your time. Again, hope this presentation is made available to you afterwards. If you'd like to, please feel free to reach out to me. But right now, again, thank you for your time and love to answer any questions.